Downhill racing is often considered the Formula One of mountain biking. At the professional level, these bikes are pushed to the absolute limit at speeds that most riders can't even fathom. But what can these bikes do for the rest of us that aren't competing at that top level? From enduro to cross-country and everything in between, there are lots of questions that new riders have about all of these subgenres, and some myths that need to be busted. This video is the final part of a series where I tell you who these bikes are for and if you should consider buying one. This time we're looking at downhill bikes, the beasts of the mountain biking world, designed to be taken to the edge and still survive. And joining me is former downhill world champion Miranda Miller.
You know, you're like riding your enduro bike and you ride it every day and it's like fun, and then you like get on your downhill bike and you're like, nothing is as good as this.
Along with Miranda, I've got Nick from the YouTube channel VanCam.
Things like going fast and hitting jumps are cool, and they make those things easier.
There's a lot to unpack about this world of downhill bikes, more than you might even expect. So let's get started. Downhill is a time trial discipline of mountain biking, taking some inspiration from skiing, where riders start at the top of a course and get to the finish line as fast as possible.
Downhill racing now compared to 10 years ago, I think is just far more a game of perfection, more of like a mental challenge almost.
Its origins start all the way back in the late 1970s, and it's now evolved into a professional circuit with teams competing from all over the world. There are also grassroots or local races that happen everywhere as well, with this side of the sport available to pretty much everyone that has a bike, although of course it can be costly.
At a certain level, I think you need a downhill bike to race downhill. I mean, at a local level, you can race on your trail bike. The trail bike I'm riding right now, it pretty much feels like a downhill bike, but if I was to take that to a real downhill track, then no, it's not the same.
And evolving from this racing, we've seen bike parks pop up everywhere that can cater to those of us who only care about getting in as many laps as possible. And it's this type of rider that's going to be interested in this video the most. A regular bike park rider that is thinking a downhill bike may be in their future. But with enduro bikes so burly nowadays, how would you even benefit from riding a downhill bike over a more do-it-all machine? It's time to take a look at what makes a downhill bike a downhill bike. The main feature that defines a downhill bike is the amount of suspension. Pretty much every model will have 200mm of travel front and rear. You'll find dual crown forks up front, which are stiffer and stronger to cope with bigger impacts. Out back, you'll either find an air shock or a coil shock. That's all down to rider preference, and suspension technology has advanced so much now that both of them work really well. Disc brakes will be 200mm front and rear. The frame will have a long wheelbase for better stability at higher speeds, and the head angle as slack as possible. No dropper post, as these things aren't meant to be ridden up hills at all, as can also be seen by the gearing. The chainring will be larger, and the cassette will likely be the same as a road bike setup. This is because it's all about being able to go even faster than the speed you're already going. The dimensions of the handlebar and stem will, however, be similar to those that you'll see on an enduro or trail bike nowadays. With a downhill bike being larger and having more suspension, those bigger 29-inch wheels become trickier to handle. That's why you'll see a wide range of wheel sizes, with 27.5, both 29, or a mixture of 29 up front and 27.5 out back, just like I have here. But to understand this a bit more, let's now talk about what it's like to ride a downhill bike. As they are larger bikes, you'll find that you have to be more deliberate, and it's going to take more strength to move them around. Even the lightest downhill bikes still weigh 35 pounds or more. Now that's 20% more than most enduro bikes. But the faster you go, the easier they are to maneuver around.
I would say a downhill bike is perfect some of the times, depending on what you're riding. It's perfect for going as fast as you can. But if you're in your local trails that are pretty flat and there's any sort of uphill, yeah, it's just gonna suck.
Back in 2016, we started to see downhill bikes have 29-inch wheels, with pro racers touting them as being the fastest option. But more recently, we've seen a lot of them start to put 27.5 wheels on the back, and running what's known as a mullet setup.
The mullet setup, I think, is the best. I actually do not know if it's faster. I just feel like I can move my body weight around on my bike a bit better.
The reason for this is that as the rear wheel gets to the end of its travel, it'll hit the rider on the butt. buzzing most people's rear ends unless they're pretty tall. And also, the larger wheels create more rotational weight, which translates to it being harder to corner. Unless you have superior strength and skill, those big wheels will get stood up a lot easier in turns as you fight to lean the bike over.
Especially on my downhill bike, that's really exaggerated on my downhill bike. On the trail bike, not so much. And I have noticed some drawbacks to the mullet, like when you're riding really like chunky, like flatter terrain. I definitely noticed the rear wheel be like hung up a little bit more.
Any touching of the brakes will also have that same effect, and it's very different to having 29-inch wheels on your enduro or your trail bike. Sure, in a straight line it's going to be smoother, but mountain biking is all about going round turns. This is why the mullet thing has become so popular. You end up with a big front wheel that doesn't get caught in the holes and rolls over rocks far better. And out back you have something that will help you get around the turns significantly more easily and accelerate that little bit faster. I will add that if you have never ridden a downhill bike before, a front and rear 27.5 setup will be a lot easier to ride.
I prefer 27.5 inch for a downhill bike because it feels so big already, and I've never felt that if I just had bigger wheels, I would do anything better.
When you jump on a downhill bike for the first time, it's going to feel very strange. It might feel slow and lumbering while you pedal it around for a bit, sluggish and the exact opposite of playful. But this is flat ground, and it's not what it's designed for. The geometry puts your hands further behind the front axle, which will feel safer as you start pointing things down. This creates less stressful situations and puts you more in control when you start getting out of your comfort zone on steeper trails.
Can't really go anywhere.
So what does that kind of terrain look like?
It's right here. It's trails like this in a bike park. They're steep, they're rough, and they're fast. And downhill bikes with their big suspension forks, big rear shocks, big disc rotors, this is what they're designed for. And they're designed to help you do this kind of trail over and over and over again. Of course, you can ride this on an enduro bike, but 9 times out of 10, for a majority of people, you'll be able to ride this type of terrain more for longer on a downhill bike.
I think, yeah, modern downhill bikes have made it easier to race downhill, I guess. But I mean, any modern bike has made everything easier, in my opinion, you know?
At the other end of the spectrum, when things are easier and at slower speeds, those features actually make it a lot tougher to ride. I imagine that most people watching this video will be wondering if a downhill bike will make their bike park experience even more enjoyable. The short answer is yeah, it probably will, especially if you like riding flowy tracks that are filled with berms. The ones that make you feel like you're on train tracks going at fast speeds. But not everyone will be getting up to those speeds. And if you're going at a slower pace, it's something to be aware of.
Have a look at what we've got here. We've got a really mellow berm. It's very big, the trail is very wide, and the trail is very flat. And this is where downhill bikes pretty much suck. Because they're heavier, they're bigger, they're longer, they're slacker, they're all these things. It makes it much harder to maneuver on these berms. So as you can see here, this S-bend comes down, round, up here. You're probably not going to have that much speed, which is going to make things a lot harder to manage on the downhill bike versus a trail or an enduro bike. So if you're going to be riding a blue flow trail like this, as you can see, without much speed, the bike doesn't work as well.
Downhill bikes are designed to be ridden fast, in the same way that a Formula 1 car is meant to be pushed to the limit. And like a Formula 1 car, if you used it to go to the shops and back, it's just not going to work properly. Yes, they smooth out even the roughest of flow trails, but at slower speeds, you're nowhere near getting a downhill bike to work properly.
The 200 millimeters of suspension that you're generally going to find on downhill bikes, as you can see here, this rubber ring is what I've been using so far, just riding these berms on this blue trail. But as you can see, I've also not used all of this section up here. Yeah, a downhill bike, it is going to make it nice and comfortable. It's very easy to set up, so you go and rent one at a bike park like here, but you don't actually need all of this suspension.
As I talked about in my Enduro Bike Explainer video, the big pedal bikes are perfectly capable as an all-rounder to survive a whole bunch of laps. But there is a significant difference between them and the level of comfort that a downhill bike can provide. With all that suspension, downhill bikes will absorb pretty much everything and anything. It will feel like you're riding the sofa from your living room down a trail.
Let's say you're riding a bike park, much like this one, which is Sun Peaks in BC and Canada. you'll encounter these things called braking bumps, kind of washboard things that you'll find in many of the corners, and they're very rough on your hands. Now, this is where the downhill bike is going to help things a lot. When these are bigger, this is what's really going to hurt your hands on long days in the bike park. Now, on a downhill bike, because there's so much suspension and these big tires as well, it's going to absorb these bumps a lot more.
I like my downhill bike better than my enduro for a few reasons. Then they are easier to ride. Fast bumps are just smoothed out by the downhill bike.
That translates to less arm pump, wrist and shoulder ache, and you'll likely be able to do more laps in the park. So for someone riding a bike park for the first time, and will probably be exclusively riding huge berms on flow trails, you will be able to survive riding for longer. With that comfort physically, you're also going to be more comfortable mentally. The increase in stability and more powerful brakes will give you more faith that the machine won't let you down in that moment of need. Back in 2013, I spent 3 weeks road tripping across Europe on a downhill bike for the first time. And in that short time, my riding progressed a lot. I put it down solely to the confidence that I was gaining from the bike, and here's an explanation about why that happened.
Now what we've got here is a pretty decent sized rock roll, and there's a beeline around the side that is being used. There are riders choosing not to ride down this. On a downhill bike, it's made so much easier. Now if you're looking to find some confidence to do a feature like this, then this is where I really recommend renting a downhill bike for a day or even a few days and just see what it's like. It's my belief that fear really comes from not knowing what's going to happen. Now a downhill bike makes this easier. The better brakes, the bigger suspension, the slacker geometry, all of that adds up to being more stable and more comfortable on a bike. And this is what I found on my first trip.
It's at the edge of my riding is where I've improved my confidence, because the downhill bike let me do things that are just a little bit more scary on an enduro bike, and it lets you do them, and then once you do them on the downhill bike, it's a little easier to get on the enduro or a smaller trail bike and do them that way.
I think my riding has improved because riding downhill, I think it makes you focus so much more on what you're doing.
Dude, what happened? That's like super slick, isn't it?
I dropped in and I was like, that looks wet. So then I just switched and I was just like, you have no choice. You've just got to try and be good at mountain biking now.
And renting a downhill bike is what I'd recommend. Because for a significantly large majority of people, owning a downhill bike just doesn't make any sense. There are such a small amount of situations where you truly need to own a bike like this that buying one is just bad economics. Renting one is such a good idea when you visit a bike park, as a good bike shop will maintain them well, and if things go wrong, they'll be right at the bottom to fix it for you. There are a few groups that would make good use of a downhill bike, of course. Those that want to race regularly and will be taking on rough tracks, with aspirations of taking things as seriously as they can.
If you're in a position to have multiple bikes and you're like a younger rider, maybe the French do it where their younger riders have to compete in like every discipline, and I think that's really cool. And I don't think kids nowadays should like pigeonhole themselves, be like, oh no, I'm just like an enduro racer or something. I think you can learn so much from racing downhill.
Then there's the riders that are riding steep or fast bike park laps regularly with no interest in pedaling up at all.
If you live near a bike park, that's a pretty good sign that you should buy a downhill bike, or at least consider one. If you shuttle a lot and you have trails that are similar to bike parks with huge jumps and fast, steep, rowdy bits where you think having a downhill bike will be fun to have.
And finally, there are the lucky people that have the capacity to own more than one bike. If you fall into one of these categories, then yeah, you should buy a downhill bike. But what needs to be remembered at all times is that it's extremely hard to take these bikes to the limit that they were designed for. A lot of people will be maxing them out at around 80 to 90%, whereas owning an enduro style of mountain bike will mean that you have something more versatile and you aren't limited by the type of mountain biking that you can do, which is very important. Yes, downhill bikes are simply not practical for pretty much every mountain biker to own, but I would still highly recommend trying one if you've never ridden one before. That feeling of confidence that you get from such a stable and inspiring bike can be transferred to the rest of your riding. You'll know what happens when you ride off that drop or send that bigger jump, and it's going to make you a better mountain biker. And that's why downhill bikes are sick. With so many requests, I have brought back the Team Slow and Awkward merch, and I'll be upping my merch game this year. Hit the link to my store down below this video and grab yourself some sweet kit. All profits will go straight back into making videos just like this one. If you've enjoyed this video, then make sure that you watch the other videos in the series, subscribe to the channel for my future videos, and leave a like while you're there. Cheers punters, I'll see you next time.